This video is made possible by Nebula. Use the link down in the description below to support RealLifeLore directly by signing up, where you can watch 26 additional and exclusive full-length videos in my ongoing Nebula Modern Conflict series, covering recent major wars and crises, including this video's next part covering how ISIS was defeated in Iraq and Syria. Perhaps more than any other country today in the 21st century, Saudi Arabia has the most uncertain future ahead of itself. The country truly has almost countless problems ahead of it that it must overcome in order to survive. And they've only been able to overcome all of these problems so far because of their dominance over a critical resource that everyone in the world has wanted for the past 100 years, but from which the world is currently starting to move away from: oil. The Saudi Arabian state is one that is nearly utterly defined by its control over this black liquidy resource. As recently as 2018, the petroleum business in the country accounted for a whopping 87% of the government's annual budget, 90% of the country's export earnings, and a massive 42% of the country's entire GDP. This is because Saudi Arabia is known today to control approximately a quarter of all the proven oil reserves in the world. The second largest reserves of all the world's countries, second only to Venezuela. But unlike Venezuela's technically larger oil reserves, which are highly crude, difficult, and expensive to access, Saudi Arabia's only slightly smaller reserves are located under pressure just beneath the Earth's surface, and they are extremely easy and cheap to access, and they're much easier to refine. This is why for decades, Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil in the world, and is currently the world's second largest producer, just barely behind the United States. Alongside Russia, these three countries are collectively referred to as the Big Three of global oil production today, because no single other country comes anywhere close to matching them, and they combined produce approximately 40% of all the oil in the world. But America's population is 332 million, and so most of America's oil production is consumed within the country and not exported abroad, which is why America is only the world's 14th largest oil exporter. Saudi Arabia has just about a tenth of the American population, but produces nearly as much oil as it, meaning that they simply have far more that they can never possibly consume on their own, and so they have far more left over to export to other countries. Saudi Arabia is thus by far the largest exporter of oil in the world. And oil continues to provide roughly a third of all the energy that humanity collectively consumes worldwide. Countries like India, China, Japan, South Africa, and numerous European states all import enormous volumes of their own oil supplies from Saudi Arabia, and are thus all heavily reliant on keeping those flows of oil continuing for now. It is this simple calculus that has given Saudi Arabia enormous geopolitical power and clout over the past century, because they've just got more oil to give others than anybody else. And more than any other country, Saudi Arabia is the one most capable of influencing the global price of oil, either negatively or positively. This is because, besides being by far the largest exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia also has by far the largest spare capacity of oil production. And this is what truly gives the Saudi state its unbelievable levels of global power. Spare capacity in the oil business refers to the number of oil wells that a country possesses that are not currently being used, but which can be brought online again in a very short notice to rapidly increase production. Saudi Arabia wields the largest spare capacity of oil production in the world, and they usually keep around 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day of oil production reserved in this spare capacity. By rapidly turning the spare capacity back online, Saudi Arabia can rapidly increase its globally significant oil production and dump those extra supplies onto the world market, thus decreasing global prices of oil. And by doing the reverse, by shutting more wells offline and increasing its available spare capacity, Saudi Arabia can rapidly decrease its globally significant oil production and restrict global oil supplies, thus increasing worldwide oil scarcity and increasing global oil prices. This is why Saudi Arabia is often referred to as the central bank of world oil, and it's how the Saudi state can exert significant leverage over every single country in the world, including the world's most powerful country, the United States. While America only imports a fraction of its oil supply from Saudi Arabia these days, overall oil prices in the United States can still be severely impacted by the whims of the absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia. After the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the Western world immediately passed a series of sanctions against Russia that shut that country's oil supply out of their markets, which obviously reduced the supply of oil in their markets and led to a rise in oil prices. And when oil prices rise, it tends to increase inflation in every other sector of the economy. economy, because nearly every business in the world relies on oil at some point in time in its production process, which means that when oil prices go up, businesses have to raise their prices in order to offset their increased production costs. So, after the Russians invaded Ukraine and the global price of oil shot up, and inflation rates went up along with it, the Biden administration in the United States requested that Saudi Arabia turn more of their spare capacity on and ramp up production to place more oil onto the global market, in order to decrease oil prices that would help tame global inflation. But the Saudis instead did the complete opposite. They ended up cutting more of their production over and over these past several months, adding more wells to their offline spare capacity and decreasing the supply of global oil in coordination with Russia, which is increasing oil prices around the world, which is enabling the Russians to earn more money on their own oil sales that is being plowed into waging their war in Ukraine, and it is increasing inflationary pressures in gasoline prices in the United States. As of May 2023, the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, the usually massive emergency stockpile of petroleum that the United States keeps stashed away in tanks in Louisiana and Texas to release during an oil supply crisis, has been gradually depleted every single day since the invasion of Ukraine began, to the lowest level seen in 40 years right now since 1983. Doing so has helped tame gasoline prices in the country for now, but with the reserve now heavily depleted, Washington possesses very little other options available to keep gasoline prices from spiraling upwards leading up to the November 2024 presidential election, other than calling Saudi Arabia and requesting them to turn more of their spare capacity back online, which the Saudis will surely only do if they are given certain favors. This is precisely how Saudi Arabia is able to wield its oil might and exert geopolitical influence across the entire world in the process. But Saudi Arabia's great challenge in the 21st century is that this greatest of its powers has a finite lifespan remaining. And at a certain point in the future, a day will come when this power will completely evaporate altogether. Because over the next several decades, as countries around the world steadily continue moving their economies away from oil as an energy source, Saudi Arabia's great advantage of being the global oil business's central bank will matter less and less. And if the country does nothing to change itself between now and whenever that uncertain future date arrives, it will only be left with sand, one of the worst human rights records on the planet, an archaic religious absolute monarchy that most of the outside world finds repugnant, and a lack of protection from the United States, while being surrounded by countless enemies from both within and without. If Saudi Arabia does nothing to change, Saudi Arabia will no longer exist at all by the end of the century. But change is also going to be very, very hard and uncertain. And if you want to understand where Saudi Arabia is going in the future, you've got to understand where Saudi Arabia came from in the first place, and why the country would have almost certainly never managed to exist at all in its current form, were it not for the very fortunate discovery of oil very early on into its history. For thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula was divided between various different tribes, sheiks, kings, and empires. There was very little to note about the lands in the center of the Arabian Peninsula where the House of Saud first originated in history, a little more than 300 years ago, in a region known as the Najd. The overwhelming majority of Saudi Arabia's current lands are completely uninhabitable. The country is, after all, the largest in the world today that doesn't have a single river anywhere to be found within it. Rainfall across most of the country's land is extremely scarce, and so fresh water for drinking and agriculture have historically been extremely difficult to come by. Across the south of the modern country is a vast desert known as the Rub al-Khali, better known in English as the Empty Quarter. It is the largest continuous expanse of sand that can be found anywhere in the world. It is nearly completely devoid of life, and it is larger in area than the entirety of France. The region of Najd, deep within the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, was an extremely sparsely populated and isolated backwater, separated from the rest of the world by vast empty deserts and high mountains with nothing of value to offer anyone in the outside world. It was a place hardly anyone paid any attention to, and its extreme isolation from the rest of the world was partially why an extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam gradually developed there, now sometimes known as Wahhabism. It was an unlikely place from which one of the most powerful nations of the modern world would arise from, but so it did regardless. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, two small and largely unknown family clans within the Najd region cemented an alliance between themselves. The House of Saud, who would run the politics and day-to-day governance of the lands they controlled, and the clan of Wahhab. who would run the land's religious affairs based upon their own extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, the previously mentioned branch of the faith that is sometimes referred to as Wahhabism. After joining forces, the Saud and Wahhab alliance went on to carve out the first Saudi state that survived between 1744 and 1814, before it was ultimately destroyed by the Ottomans. A group of survivors managed to take back the Saud's ancestral capital at Riyadh in 1818, and from there they carved out the second Saudi state that survived for most of the rest of the 19th century until 1891, when catastrophic infighting among the royal family and conflict with a rival family clan known as the Rashidis led to the state's ultimate collapse. The surviving Saud family members were forced to flee from Riyadh as exiles into nearby Kuwait, where they were powerless without any lands and without any wealth, but with a very good historical claim to the supposedly worthless lands of Najd in the interior of Arabia. There and then, the Saud family probably would have vanished into irrelevance, never to be seen or heard from again, were it not for the ambitions of a young man of the family who would ultimately become known as Ibn Saud, the man who would create the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Determined to restore his family's position of power, a 27-year-old Ibn Saud in 1902 led a party of a couple dozen loyal men from Kuwait to recapture his family's ancestral seat in Riyadh from the rival Rashidi clan. It was the beginning of a decades-long campaign of conquest waged across Arabia for the young man. But at first, very few people from the outside world paid any attention to it. The lands that now constitute Saudi Arabia back then in the early 20th century may have only been home to as few as 2 million people, who were almost entirely very poor desert roaming nomads. And so the squabbling between two rival clans in these lands was hardly noticed by any of the great powers of the day. But things began shifting during World War I. The Rashidi clan was allied to the Ottoman Empire, and after the war broke out, the British began supplying weapons and cash to Ibn Saud, who was fighting against them. That, combined with Ibn Saud's own alliance to the ultra-Sunni Wahhabi clan that provided tens of thousands of fanatical and now well-armed troops, proved decisive. By the early 1920s, the Najd region of Arabia had been entirely conquered, but the campaigns weren't quite finished yet. After World War I's conclusion and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the British appointed the Arab Hashemite family as the new reigning monarchs in 3 newly created kingdoms: Iraq, Jordan, and the Hejaz, which crucially included the 2 holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. But relations between the British and the Hashemite family quickly soured after the war's conclusion, after the British transformed Jordan and Iraq into colonial mandates and began letting Jews settle in Palestine. The Hashemites ruling the Kingdom of Hejaz refused to ratify the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, and so the British withdrew their support for the family and backed up their other Arab wartime ally, Ibn Saud and his expanding kingdom in the Najd. Emboldened, Ibn Saud launched a new military campaign by invading the Kingdom of Hejaz in 1924, which was fully conquered within only a single year. By 1925, the modern territory of Saudi Arabia was fully under the control of Ibn Saud after more than 20 years worth of nearly constant warfare, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. A few years later on, in 1932, Ibn Saud proclaimed the creation of a brand new kingdom over all of these lands, and he named it after himself and his family, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with himself, naturally, as the new kingdom's absolute monarch. The third Saudi state had been born, covering a large amount of the lands that the previous 2 Saudi states from the 19th and 18th centuries had also encompassed. The very basis of Ibn Saud's argument and later the Saudi state's argument right up into the 2020s today, that he was merely restoring his own family's historical territorial claims. But his new kingdom entered into life in 1932 as a severely troubled one. The kingdom had been created through decades worth of violent warfare and conquest, and many of the lands Ibn Saud now controlled were forcefully conquered, and included many people who found his alliance with the extremely orthodox Wahhabists as off-putting. Shia Muslim minority populations were found in the eastern province near the Red Sea, and in the south near Yemen, who often felt religiously persecuted by the Sunni fundamentalist, Wahhabi-aligned regime. And even less strict fellow Sunni Muslims in the now conquered Kingdom of Hejaz felt on edge. Moreover, the exiled and furious Hashemite family continued to rule kingdoms in neighboring Jordan and Iraq, with very good claims to the Hejaz region. Internal instability within the new kingdom was rife, and to try and preserve the peace, Ibn Saud married a daughter of every one of the other tribes he had conquered. 20 wives in all, who would go on to produce more than 100 children for him, including 45 sons, 6 of whom would go on to later rule the kingdom after his death. including the current 87-year-old king today in 2023, who was born when Ibn Saud was 60. And after decades of warfare, the new kingdom's finances were in a pretty terrible state. With nothing but a tiny tax base of 2 million impoverished people, the only actually important thing that Ibn Saud's new kingdom controlled to earn money from was its control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which only brought in modest amounts of religious tourism to the state's struggling coffers. At this point in time, it was far more likely that either Egypt or Iraq, with their plentiful agricultural farmland around the Nile and Tigris-Euphrates rivers, would emerge as the dominant source of the Arab world's geopolitical power in the 20th century, just as they had both been for literally all of human history beforehand. But of course, the discovery of oil suddenly changed everything. You see, oil had been discovered previously in commercial quantities in nearby Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, and Ibn Saud had convinced himself that there was still oil to be discovered within his kingdom nearby as well. But it was the British who had discovered oil in Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, and Ibn Saud didn't exactly trust the imperialist and colonial tendencies of them. So, instead, Ibn Saud went to the Americans to get them searching for oil in his kingdom. In 1933, the year after his kingdom was proclaimed, Standard Oil Company of California, or SoCal, later known as Chevron, was granted the exclusive contract to begin the search. It was only 5 years later, in 1938, when they made the first discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia at a well known as Dammam No. 7 right by the Persian Gulf. Initially, SoCal created a wholly owned subsidiary assigned to the oil they discovered in Saudi Arabia that would eventually be named Arabian American Oil Company, aka Aramco. After Saudi Arabia managed to take full control over the subsidiary company itself later on, it became simply known as Saudi Aramco, the modern state-owned Saudi oil giant. From 1938 onwards, more and more oil fields were steadily discovered across Saudi Arabia's sparsely populated eastern province, and production steadily increased up to the point where the country was the 22nd largest producer of oil in the world, significant enough to begin attracting the attention of the American government during World War II. Oil was becoming more important than ever before during that war, and the American president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knew that America and the post-war Washington-led alliance structure needed as much oil as they could possibly get to compete with the Soviet bloc in the war's aftermath. Ibn Saud was a man who still had many enemies, with the British-backed Hashemites still in power in Iraq and Jordan, and many Saudis within the country who didn't like his and the Wahhabists' absolute rule. And so it eventually became time for him and FDR to finally meet. They did so upon a ship in the Suez Canal in February of 1945, mere weeks before FDR's own death, and their agreement became the basis for the Saudi-American relationship that has largely endured ever since. The United States, despite being a secular constitutional republic, would back the ultra-Islamic absolute monarchy of Saudi Arabia, because both had something the other desperately wanted. America wanted access to the increasingly important Saudi oil fields, both for itself and for its allies all around the world, while the Saudis wanted America's security, because, as a sparsely populated country with nothing of value whatsoever besides for oil, they knew they could never hope to defend themselves or their oil on their own, either against their own people or their external rivals. But who would ever dare to attack them if they had the backing of the most powerful country in the world? Over time, this basic arrangement between America and Saudi Arabia, security guarantees in exchange for oil, has continually evolved but remained more or less the same ever since. Ibn Saud died in 1953, and his sons have ruled the kingdom as absolute monarchs ever since. Eventually, more oil fields were discovered around the initial Dammam No. 7 well, like Safaniya in the Gulf, the largest offshore oil field ever discovered in the world, and the mighty Ghavar field, the largest onshore oil field ever discovered and the largest single source of human energy that we as a species have ever so far discovered. It turned out that the lands Ibn Saud had conquered for his kingdom were not so worthless or useless after all, because they contained within them the most valuable oil fields that have ever been discovered on the planet. Money began flooding into the kingdom as the oil fields continued to be developed, but the true era of wealth only came after the 1973 oil crisis. After Israel defeated the combined Arab armies of Egypt and Syria during the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC oil cartel, made up of major oil-producing countries from all around the world, decided to embargo many of Israel's most major supporters, including the United States. Saudi Arabia briefly participated in that embargo, and the global price of oil subsequently quadrupled and remained high for more than a decade afterwards. The flood of money into Saudi Arabia suddenly became a deluge of money over the following decade, and the kingdom became one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And the House of Saud became one of the wealthiest families in the world. It was with this unbelievable money that Saudi Arabia made its great bargain with the people of the kingdom. The centuries-old alliance between the House of Saud and the clan of Wahhab remained intact, meaning that the Saudi state was governed by a set of extremely fundamentalist Sunni Muslim values that a lot of the state's minority groups, like the Shia and less fundamentalist Sunnis, didn't exactly get along with very well, which in a vacuum would have led to domestic instability. But the enormous revenues that the state was earning from its oil business enabled the government to basically just bribe all of its citizens into complicity. And so Saudi Arabia essentially became a massive welfare state for all of its citizens. Zero taxes were levied on anything or anyone because oil was paying for all of the government's budget. A flood of money went into subsidizing everything for Saudi Arabia's citizens, from healthcare, education, food, water, fuel, electricity, and whatever else you could possibly think of. Nearly all of the citizens' needs were completely being covered by the government, and in exchange, it was expected that all of the citizens would accept some of the strictest and most totalitarian religious laws anywhere in the world. And, more importantly, accept the House of Saud's absolute legitimacy to rule a medieval kingdom in a 20th century world. As the 20th century continued progressing, oil production in the United States diminished, while production in Saudi Arabia only increased, to the point where the kingdom even overtook America to become the world's largest oil producer for decades. America became increasingly committed to protecting the kingdom's strategically important oil supply, and by 1991, as production in the United States continued to flounder, America found itself importing nearly a third of all of its imports from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. America needed to protect Saudi Arabia at all costs, but justifying doing so in Washington was growing increasingly difficult, because Saudi Arabia was growing even more totalitarian. As more and more Westerners came to the country for work in developing the numerous oil fields, the country's ultra-Orthodox Wahhabi establishment grew increasingly agitated at their growing presence. By 1979, it had just gotten to be too much for some, and a group of hundreds of armed religious militants stormed the Grand Mosque in Mecca and seized control over it, denouncing the Saudi king as a blasphemer for increasingly westernizing the country. The Grand Mosque, one of the holiest sites in all of Islam, thus became the site of a military siege that lasted for weeks as Saudi security forces battled with the militants inside to regain control. It marked the very first major direct challenge to the House of Saud's legitimacy to rule over the kingdom since its establishment back in 1932, and the Saudi monarchy chose to respond to the challenge by further embracing the Sunni Wahhabi religious leaders, and increasing the severity of religious laws in the country. All of the previous social reforms that were taking place in the country were reversed. Movie theaters were universally banned. Women were completely removed from all of the media and newspapers altogether. Women's dress codes were much more strictly enforced in public, homosexual activity was much more punished by the death penalty, and the Saudi state-sanctioned religious police increased their patrols on the streets to rigorously enforce the newly strengthened religious laws. For the next 40-odd years, Saudi Arabia would be among the most theocratic and totalitarian regimes anywhere on the planet, as the ruling Saudi royal family used strict Islamic religious laws to strengthen their own legitimacy in the eyes of the ultra-conservatives of the country. But the trend towards religious fundamentalism at home would eventually go on to produce even more problems for the kingdom in the future, and even jeopardize its relationship with its own greatest protector and security guarantor, the United States. It was no coincidence that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were initially both produced within the ultra-religious environment of Saudi Arabia. In 1990, when Saddam's Iraq appeared likely to invade Saudi Arabia, bin Laden offered the Saudi king his own mujahideen fighters who were battle-hardened during the Afghan war against the Soviets to resist. But the king refused and instead decided to allow the Americans to send hundreds of thousands of their troops to defend the kingdom against the invasion instead. The presence of hundreds of thousands of Americans within the kingdom granted by the king, who is supposed to be the protector of the two Islamic holy cities, infuriated bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and the outrage was never forgiven. In 1995, bin Laden declared that the king of Saudi Arabia was a heretic, and a war between the kingdom and al-Qaeda has raged on ever since, with al-Qaeda continually seeking ways to overthrow the monarchy and replace it with what it sees as its own vision of restored fundamentalist Sunni theocratic rule. But the fact that Osama bin Laden himself was born in Saudi Arabia, and that many of al-Qaeda's fighters as well turned out to be Saudi citizens, including 15 out of the 19 hijackers responsible for carrying out the 9/11 attacks, has remained a sore spot for relations between the kingdom and the United States ever since. But in addition to the growing Sunni Islamist threat within the kingdom, represented by the likes of al-Qaeda, who felt that the Saudi royal family wasn't quite religious enough, external threats to the Saudis' rule in the kingdom were greatly growing in numbers as well. The emergence of the revolutionary Shia Islamist regime in neighboring Iran in 1979 presented the Saudi kingdom with its most major external arch-enemy that it has been locked in an on-again, off-again Cold War with ever since. The revolutionary regime in Iran had overthrown their own absolute monarch after all, and replaced him with a totalitarian Islamic theocracy, ruled by the country's Shiite clergy and their supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and they were intent on exporting their revolution to every other monarchist regime in the Islamic world, and overthrowing all of their kings as well, including Saudi Arabia's monarchy and the other Gulf Arab states. But for a time, both revolutionary Iran and absolute monarchist Saudi Arabia found some common ground in their mutual enemy in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Saddam had led Iraq into a brutal invasion of Iran in 1980, and then in 1990, Saddam invaded and annexed Kuwait and was preparing the Iraqi army to invade Saudi Arabia next. The United States and a massive coalition involving Saudi Arabian troops intervened and kicked the Iraqi army out of Kuwait and liberated the country in 1991. But Saddam still remained in power and remained as a potential threat to both the Saudis and the Iranians for the next decade. Relations between Tehran and Riyadh were therefore fairly cordial, but that all suddenly ended in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks and overthrew Saddam and replaced him with a democratic republic. A move that Saudi Arabia fiercely disagreed with Washington over. And part of why they disagreed with it so strongly was because they knew that with Saddam now out of the way, the Iranians would make moves into exporting their revolution into Iraq next. Which is exactly what they began doing. Iraq, with the majority of its population being Shia Muslim Arabs and immediately adjacent to Iran, was one of the most obvious first targets for the Iranians to export their revolution into. Quickly after Saddam was removed by the Americans, Iranian troops began entering into the country and building militia organizations out of the country's large Shia Muslim population, and indoctrinating them with Iran's revolutionary anti-monarchist zeal. Naturally, to try and prevent Iraq from becoming essentially an Iranian-controlled puppet, the Saudis began funding and supplying Iraqi Sunni Muslim militias to counteract them, and the first major proxy war between Tehran and Riyadh had begun. Then in 2011, the United States mostly withdrew all of their troops from Iraq, and that very same year, the Arab Spring revolutions began sweeping all across the Arab world, as restless and angry Arab populations unsatisfied with their longtime regimes began taking to the streets for change. Popular revolutions eventually managed to topple the long-standing regimes in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen, while enormous civil wars exploded in Libya, Yemen, and Syria. Fearful about the wave of revolution penetrating into their own long-standing kingdom and their own potentially restless population, the Saudis began massively increasing their purchases of American-made weapons, tanks, jets, and ships to keep themselves in power in a series of deals worth tens of billions of dollars. But the confrontation between revolutionary Iran and monarchist Saudi Arabia quickly came to a boiling point over the small island of Bahrain just off of the Saudi coast. Approximately 60% of the island's total population are Shia Muslims, but the ruling monarchy there are Sunni Muslims. Revolutionary Shia Iran on the other side of the Gulf further claims Bahrain as a lost Iranian province based on their own historical territorial claims to the island, and has repeatedly pressed the issue and insisted that the Shia majority on the island are being repressed by the minority Sunni monarchy. Back in 1986, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain finished the construction of the 25-kilometer King Fahd Causeway that connects the island to the Saudi mainland. It was ostensibly built to further facilitate trade and travel between the two countries, but one cannot help to notice that it can also be used as a bridge for Saudi tanks and soldiers to come storming into the island across were the island's monarchy ever in jeopardy of falling during a revolution. Were Iran to successfully foment a revolution on the island that would do that and install a revolutionary Shia government similar to their own in its place, the very existence of the Saudi state itself would be directly put into question. The island is only located about 60 kilometers away from Saudi Arabia's largest single oil field, Ghafar, only about 50 kilometers away from the headquarters of Saudi Aramco, the state-owned oil company, and only about 80 kilometers away from Ras Tanura, which is the Saudis' largest oil export terminal and indeed the largest one in the world. Moreover, Bahrain is placed directly off the coast of the Shia Muslim majority areas of eastern Saudi Arabia, where nearly the entirety of Saudi Arabia's oil reserves and infrastructure are also located. Meaning that were the Iranians to successfully export their revolution into Shia majority Bahrain and topple the Sunni monarchy there, the next target would be the next door Shia majority areas of eastern Saudi Arabia, which could put the entire Saudi oil business into jeopardy, which could put the entire Saudi monarchy and state into jeopardy. And that could never be tolerated. So when uprisings began in Bahrain aimed at toppling the monarchy in 2011, Saudi troops indeed came storming across the bridge to help put them down. Saudi Arabia came to back the rebels seeking to overthrow Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, because if it worked and he was removed, it would be Iran who would lose a core component of their overall grand strategy. The Assad regime in Syria has been a core ally of the Iranians for decades over their mutual opposition to Israel, and together with an Iranian-dominated Iraq, they form Iran's so-called land bridge across the Middle East towards the Mediterranean Sea, enabling Iranian militias and proxies to safely and reliably transport weapons to Iranian-aligned organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and across the Mediterranean Sea to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, who all share Iran's desire to destroy the Israeli state from existence. It also, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, makes it appear that Iran is attempting to encircle them and overthrow their kingdom. Thus, to shatter Iran's land bridge and break out of their potential encirclement, the Saudis backed up rebel forces in Syria while Iran backed up the regime. The proxy war quickly extended into Libya as well, as the Saudis backed the Tobruk-based House of Representatives government against the Iranian-supported Tripoli-based government of National Accord. But the absolute terror in the royal halls of Riyadh over being encircled by the revolutionary Iranians came to a fever pitch in 2014, when the Shia-adjacent Houthi movement suddenly managed to conquer the Yemeni capital, and was advancing on the city of Aden next, the most significant port anywhere between the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. Were the Houthis to completely capture the entirety of Yemen, it would have placed a highly militant and probably revolutionary Shiite Muslim power closely aligned with the Iranians across not only more than 1,300 kilometers of their southern border near to their own Shia Muslim subjects in the south of the country, but also directly on the strategic maritime choke point of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. Were that to happen, Saudi Arabia truly would be effectively encircled and checkmated, surrounded by a hostile Iran who wants nothing more than to topple its monarchy, and Iran's allies placed into power in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and potentially in Bahrain and in Yemen as well. Iran could hypothetically mine or blockade the Strait of Hormuz, regulating all the maritime traffic between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, while the Houthis could simultaneously use Iranian-supplied missiles and weapons to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. Such a scenario would be an utter doomsday one for the Saudis, because they would lose the easiest ability to export all of their oil to their largest customers in East Asia. The only way remaining for them to continue exporting oil at all under that scenario would be via the Suez Canal through Egypt. But even that too nearly came under risk. After the revolution in Egypt toppled the longtime dictator of that country in 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood's candidate came to power in a democratic election next. The Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni Islamist organization that, like Iran, is also staunchly opposed to the concept of monarchies in the Islamic world, including the Saudi monarchy, so obviously the Saudis despise them. Were a Brotherhood government in Egypt to, hypothetically, deny the Saudis access to the Suez Canal, in conjunction with the Houthis and Iranians shutting down their access through the Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz Straits, and nobody like the Americans did anything to stop it, Saudi Arabia would just completely collapse very rapidly because they would lose any ability to actually export any of their oil out of the country, and 87% of their government's budget would just evaporate, meaning their ability to bribe all of their divided and repressed citizenry would end, and their ability to buy massive amounts of weapons would end. and their monarchy would just collapse into dust. And thus, the Saudis sponsored a military coup in Egypt in 2013 that luckily for them panned out and overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood from power, and replaced it with a much more friendly military government. But coups and plots would not work to dislodge the Houthis from power in Yemen. Instead, the Saudis initiated a massive military intervention of their own into the country, with enormous bombing and missile attacks and a devastating naval blockade to choke the Houthis into submission and remove what they perceived as Iran's revolutionary influence from the country. Yemen thus became the focal point for the Iranian-Saudi rivalry from 2015 onwards, and the Saudis agreed to buy up tens of billions of dollars more worth of additional American weaponry to wage that war with. Weapons that would help contribute to what the United Nations has described as one of the 21st century's greatest humanitarian catastrophes. The Saudi Arabian defense budget exponentially exploded to fight the war in Yemen, and to fight all of these other proxy conflicts in Iraq, in Syria, and in Libya, because the Saudi royal family saw external enemies circling all around them, all being led and coordinated by the revolutionary Iranians. And they decided to respond in the only way they knew how to do: throw tens of billions of dollars at the problem they earned from selling their oil and hope it all went away. Saudi defense spending grew so high in the mid to late 2010s that it became roughly on a par with Russia, and was only outmatched by the superpowers of China and the United States. In 2015, Saudi Arabia was spending $2,748 per person in the country on its military, while the United States was only spending $1,975 per person on theirs. But throwing money at trying to overpower their enemies wasn't really working. The Iranians only spent a few tens of millions of their dollars arming the Houthis in comparison to the tens of billions that the Saudis were spending attempting to crush them. And the war gradually transformed into a quagmire, with the Houthis no closer to being removed than when the war began. And after nearly 400,000 deaths in the country caused by the conflict, Bashar al-Assad has remained in power in Syria for over a decade despite the Saudis' best efforts to remove him, while Iraq increasingly falls under Iran's influence as well. And then, in September of 2019, a series of drone and cruise missile attacks bombarded Saudi Arabia's oil refineries at Abqaiq and Quraysh in the eastern province, destroying the kingdom's largest oil processing and refinery facilities. 5.7 million barrels per day worth of Saudi oil production were knocked offline in the kingdom by the attack, representing what was nothing less than the biggest disruption ever seen in the entire oil industry up to that point. The Houthis down in Yemen quickly claimed responsibility for the attack as a reprisal for the Saudi air campaign, but they were more than 1,200 kilometers away from the attack's location. American intelligence later determined that the attacks probably actually originated to the north, and were probably fired by the Iranians themselves, either from within Iran itself or from within their Shiite militia-controlled areas in Iraq. It could have been interpreted as an act of war by the kingdom, but the United States made it clear that they didn't see things that way and would not militarily back the kingdom if that's the route they chose to go down. America wasn't prepared to go to war with Iran over the issue, and with their military already struggling in Yemen, the Saudis were left with no other choice but to back down and de-escalate. The oil processing facilities were quickly repaired, and business went on as usual. But the Saudis never forgot that America had just refused to defend them. The days back when America was willing to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops to protect the kingdom and its oil back in 1991 during the Gulf War appeared in Riyadh to be over. The development of shale oil in the United States in the early 2010s had resulted in a massive increase in America's own oil production, and by 2018, the year just before the Abqaiq attack, America had finally surpassed Saudi Arabia and regained its title as the world's largest producer. America was relying less and less on Saudi oil for themselves, and by 2019, only about 7% of America's oil imports were still even coming from the kingdom, coming to how nearly a third of their oil imports were from Saudi Arabia back in 1991 during the Gulf War. As Washington began relying less on the Saudis themselves for their oil, America's distaste for Saudi Arabia's totalitarian regime and human rights practices became more pronounced as well. An absolute monarchy in the 21st century with extremely authoritarian religious laws waging a brutal war in Yemen with hundreds of thousands of deaths on its hand, all fueled by American weapons no less, and responsible for carrying out assassinations on journalists, would not be a usual ally of the United States were it not also for all of its oil. And all of that oil was becoming less important to Washington. Moreover, the world at large is beginning to move more and more away from oil as an energy source, as nations around the world try and fight back against global climate change. The countries of the European Union, many of whom are currently and historically some of Saudi Arabia's largest oil customers, are planning on completely phasing out their own fossil fuel usage by 2050. And if they're successful, none of them will be customers of the Saudis any longer within only 27 years from now. Japan also plans to eliminate oil and gas as energy sources at some point in the future this same century, though without the same strict 2050 timetable as the Europeans. One of the biggest reasons why the Americans still sort of support Saudi Arabia today, even though they import hardly any of their oil themselves, is because the Saudis still supply enormous amounts of oil to many of America's closest allies, like the NATO states in Europe and the Japanese. But when this too ends, America will have almost no reason left to continue protecting the kingdom, and the deal established between FDR and Ibn Saud nearly 80 years ago will finally come to an end. And without a major protector, and with less and less customers to continue selling their oil to, Saudi Arabia will have less money to buy weapons to defend themselves with and less money to subsidize their restless population with. And their many, many enemies both within the kingdom and outside of it will be emboldened like they have never been before to finally take their chance at overthrowing the monarchy. Thus, in order to avoid this dangerous spiral toward destruction over the coming decades, Saudi Arabia needs to radically transform its entire society and economy if it is going to survive. And this is why the current crown prince and soon-to-be king of the country, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, announced with much fanfare the Vision 2030 plan back in 2016, which aims to do exactly that. Sweeping reforms across the country have already taken place as a part of Vision 2030, and more are still to come. Women were finally granted the ability to drive in the country in 2018, while their dress codes in public were slightly relaxed, with the aim of encouraging and enabling more women to enter into the Saudi workforce. A push towards encouraging both religious and non-religious tourism to the kingdom has been sent into overdrive, with massive new building developments being put into motion around the holy city of Mecca, in order to further encourage religious tourism, and grand mega projects like the $500 billion futuristic city of Neom, the Jeddah Tower in the city of Jeddah planned to be the new tallest building in the world, and the Red Sea Islands mega project in the Red Sea, all set to attract a new set of non-religious tourists to the kingdom. Saudi Arabia even managed to secure its own Grand Prix on the Formula One calendar in 2021, and even announced a brand new airline in 2023 called Riyadh Air, which will include the purchase of 72 brand new Boeing 787 Dreamliners at a price of $37 billion. All combined, Saudi Arabia hopes to establish tourism from all around the world to the kingdom in order to add diversification in the economy away from oil, while investing hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars at the same time into a brand new sovereign wealth fund to invest in companies all around the world, to add even more diversification. And to diversify away from their own usage of oil as a fuel source, the government plans to invest aggressively into solar energy, which, in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, does have a lot of very high potential. But Vision 2030 contains within it two critical problems for the kingdom. First, while this process is ongoing and tons of tourists from the Western world begin coming to the country, while religious laws in the country are relaxed or destroyed altogether to continue encouraging them to come and visit, it is certain to generate a high degree of instability amongst Saudi Arabia's traditional Sunni Wahhabi fundamentalists. Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda previously went to war with the Saudi monarchy over their allowance of US troops into the country to protect the kingdom. So what do you think will happen if and when millions of Western tourists are being allowed to enter the country? Thus, Saudi Arabia needs as little external conflicts as possible while it is focusing on dealing with this internal conflict for years. Saudi Arabia thus wants to get out of its failed war in Yemen, and in March of 2023, they even signed a historic agreement with Iran, restoring relations with them and establishing a truce. Riyadh couldn't possibly be foolish enough to believe that the truce will last forever, as the revolutionary regime in Iran will always remain militantly committed to overthrowing their monarchy. The Saudis know that the truce with Iran is a temporary one, but Iran also wanted to take it, so they could spend the next few years focusing their efforts on Israel and the United States, while the Saudis wanted it to spend crucial time focusing inwards in implementing these vital reforms. From Riyadh's perspective, the hope is that they will finish reforming their society and emerge stronger before Iran decides to resume hostilities with them again. But in order to further guarantee that Iran and its proxies will stay off of their back, the Saudis also need to entice the United States to stick around as their protector for as long as possible. They know that America is naturally losing interest in doing that, but the Saudis still have levers that they can pull. They have even suggested that they might be willing to recognize Israel and normalize relations with the Jewish state in exchange for an ironclad US security guarantee of the kingdom, and the elevation of Saudi Arabia to the status of a major non-NATO ally, as well as gaining access to a civilian nuclear energy program which could, in a pinch, enable them to develop a nuclear weapon on their own, if the Iranians suddenly develop one first. Washington seems unprepared to accept those demands for now, over fears of being bound by treaty to go to war with Iran if the kingdom comes under attack again, and over fears of nuclear proliferation spreading across the Middle East. But the Saudis could potentially always sweeten the deal ahead of the November 2024 election, by also agreeing to turn more of their spare capacity wells back online and flooding the oil market with their fresh supply, decreasing global oil prices and inflationary pressures in America, which is part of the reason why they've been cutting production for months. They want that firm security guarantee bound in treaty from the United States. And recognizing Israel will lead to even more tensions with the Sunni Wahhabi fundamentalists within the country, and with revolutionary Iran outside of the country, who is uncompromising on their aim of destroying Israel and overthrowing the Saudi monarchy. And the second problem related to Vision 2030 is that while it is generating all of this religious instability within the kingdom, it is also going to cost an absolute fortune. Current estimates believe that the Saudis are going to end up spending more than $3 trillion on this plan to reform and diversify the kingdom. And in order to fund that enormous amount of money, Saudi Arabia is gradually selling small amounts of shares in the state-owned Saudi Aramco oil company to foreign investors, while the Saudis simultaneously need higher global oil prices for several more years to come, in order to add even more money into the state's coffers before it's all too late. Which is the other reason why they've been coordinating with the Russians to decrease production together in order to keep oil prices elevated for longer. It's not that Saudi Arabia and Russia are really aligned in any real sense. It's just that their interests in having higher worldwide oil prices are currently aligned. So then Moscow has more money to fight their war in Ukraine, and Riyadh has more money to fund their crucially important reforms. But doing so is also upsetting the United States to a pretty large degree, who obviously prefers lower global oil prices both to deprive the Russians of more money and to lower gasoline prices and inflation back at home. The Saudis are currently playing a very, very delicate balancing game as they must simultaneously weigh their own self-interest and need to reform or die, which will cost a lot of money and require high oil prices, the relationship with the United States as their biggest security guarantor and provider of arms who prefers lower oil prices, their relationship with Russia as the second largest oil exporter in the world who can most help them manipulate oil prices to be higher, but who is stuck in a proxy war with the United States and Ukraine, and their relationship with China, who is the Saudis' single largest oil customer, but who is also locked in a sort of Cold War with the United States and the Pacific over Taiwan. It is a balancing act between all of these various interests that the Saudi royal family, led by MBS, must carefully tread between for decades, and if they ever stumble along the way during any part of it, they will all immediately die and lose everything. And at the same time, this careful balancing act must all be maintained, as Iran carefully eyes them with their gains in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and as the 15,000 other members of MBS's own royal family jockey and position themselves at court in Riyadh for their own positions of power. And as the religious fundamentalists within Saudi Arabia increasingly feel that the House of Saud at large is at last fully betraying them after the 300-year-old alliance between them and the Wahhabists is ended. Internal strife within the kingdom is a certainty, and the Saudi regime is already responding to it by cracking down on emerging Islamist opposition within the kingdom whenever it can, and outside the kingdom whenever it can. It's all a part of the very complex relationship between the Saudi kingdom and radical Sunni Islamist organizations with roots in the kingdom like Al-Qaeda and even ISIS. For decades, Al-Qaeda sought to overthrow the Saudi monarchy, and its strategy to do so has been to sow as much chaos in the kingdom as possible by attacking foreigners and discouraging any tourism to the country, and attacking skilled workers in the oil and gas industry and discouraging them from coming, thus eventually leading to the kingdom's collapse by the erosion of both its oil and its tourism industries. The Saudi state has thus fought back against Al-Qaeda ever since the 1990s. But a new and perhaps even more menacing internal and external threat suddenly appeared on the scene in 2014, when ISIS exploded across the territory of Iraq and Syria in a lightning series of conquests. ISIS, too, just like Al-Qaeda before it, vowed that it would one day overthrow the Saudi Arabian monarchy, after it completed its conquest of Iraq and Syria first. And the Saudi monarchy wasn't put any more at ease after it turned out that thousands of ISIS's fighters had in fact come from within the kingdom and were Saudi citizens. Thus, in order to destroy the threat, Saudi Arabia sent military officers to Syria to help train and equip resistance fighters fighting against ISIS, and join the American-led military coalition to destroy ISIS altogether by the end of 2014. A coalition that would eventually encompass dozens of countries from all around the world in the largest military alliance seen in history since the alliance to destroy Nazi Germany 70 years beforehand. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and recent nature of discussing how an organization as infamous as ISIS was destroyed by a global military coalition over the course of years, the next part of this video would almost certainly cause the rest of the video to become demonetized and age-restricted, which ultimately would mean that YouTube's algorithm would have never promoted any of this video to you, and you probably never would have seen any of it. But thankfully, I was still able to produce the next part of this video anyway because of the power of Nebula, where you can go and watch the next 40-minute part covering exactly how ISIS was defeated across Iraq and Syria by a global coalition of nations and organizations between 2014 and 2020. And this is also just one of more than 24 exclusive full-length real-life lore videos that you can only find on Nebula in my overall modern conflict series there, that can all only be found over there because of all of their darker, more controversial subject material. There were other episodes that you can go and watch right now covering how Saudi Arabia's massive military intervention into Yemen has been going, episodes detailing the entire courses of the modern civil wars in both Syria and Libya, episodes keeping up to date with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, deeper dives into the United States-Iran conflict and the wars fought by Saddam Hussein, and dozens of others with brand new episodes releasing over there every single month. And what's even more, you also get access to all of the other amazing exclusive content on Nebula, because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all of its creators, built by me and hundreds of other independent YouTubers and podcasters. And because it's a subscription-based service, we all get to work on way bigger and higher budget productions over there than we could ever do on YouTube. That's why there's tons of other exclusive content you'll find equally fascinating from all of these other creators over there as well. And if you sign up for Nebula using my link, you'll also get free access to all of Nebula classes, where creators host classes on how to be, well, a creator. There's classes by Sam from Wendover Productions on persuasive communication, or by Devin from Legal Eagle on copyright laws, or by Patrick Willems on how to make a movie, and dozens of others, all of which are great for aspiring future creators or anyone who really just wants a peek behind the curtain. And best of all, if you sign up by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link down in the description, you'll receive an insane 40% discount for an annual subscription, which means it'll only cost you $250 a month for all of this awesome exclusive content from myself and hundreds of other independent creators. It's the absolute best way to help support what I'm doing here on Real Life Lore, and as always, thank you so much for watching.